The kingdom of Dumari was ancient enough that its oldest traditions had no single creator. They were shaped by the mistakes and victories of generations. Yet among all its customs, one rule was feared and respected more than any other: the servant year. Every royal heir, before touching the crown, was required to live not as a prince, not even as a noble, but as a basic palace servant for an entire year. The elders of Dumari claimed the tradition was born after the disastrous reign of King Okai, a ruler blinded by luxury who nearly drove the kingdom into famine because he never understood the suffering of his own people. When the council finally restored peace, they swore that no future king would ever rule from an ivory throne without first tasting the dust that ordinary people breathed daily. Over time, the tradition became both a test and a purifier. A prince who could not endure humiliation did not deserve command. A prince who could not kneel could never lead. And so the people of Dumari waited eagerly for the moment when their next heir, Ayan, son of King Meda, would finally take the test that would determine whether he was worthy of the kingdom's future. King Meda was admired for his fairness, feared for his sharp judgment, and known for his unshakable discipline. He had ruled Dumari through droughts, political storms, and invasions of wandering raiders from the east. But behind the polished gold of his crown lived a man who carried loneliness like a shadow. His wife had passed away when Ayan was only 8, and since then, the king had buried himself in statecraft, believing the kingdom needed strength more than tenderness. Ayan grew up watching his father speak more easily with generals than with him, and although King Meda loved his son deeply, he rarely showed it. Their relationship was built on duty rather than warmth. Still, Meda hoped that when Ayan completed the servant year, father and son might finally stand as equals, bound not by title but by understanding. What King Meda did not know, however, was that his most trusted advisor, Chief Minister Bolo, harbored ambitions that had been festering for years. Bolo believed he had earned the right to shape Dumari, that his influence over policies meant more than bloodlines or ancestry. In his private fantasies, he imagined his own son, Karo, wearing the crown, restoring true stability to the kingdom. Unlike many schemers, Bolo did not rely on clumsy plots. He used time, persuasion, and political webs. And when he heard that Ayan's 18th birthday was near, he felt dread coil inside him like a snake. If Ayan passed the tradition, Bolo's hopes would die forever. Ayan, unaware of the storms gathering around him, lived his days with a quiet curiosity about the world beyond gilded hallways. He had always felt uncomfortable being treated like a figure carved from gold while the servants bowed. He used to sneak out during the evenings to watch the gardeners work or to help stable boys brush the horses. He liked hearing ordinary conversations, the laughter, the complaints, the tired voices talking about family. Growing up, Ayan had eaten from golden plates, but he always wondered what the food tasted like when cooked in clay pots in the servants' quarters. Even when he had every comfort, he felt a strange longing to understand the life that most people lived. And so, when the day of the servant year arrived, he did not feel fear as most princes would. He felt anticipation. The ceremony was held at sunrise, with the courtyard filled by nobles, servants, council members, and citizens who had walked from distant villages just to witness the first step of their future king. Ayan stood in his royal garments, deep crimson with gold embroidery, yet he looked almost relieved rather than proud. King Meda, towering and imposing, stood beside him with a face carved from stone. He spoke of duty, history, and honor, his voice echoing beyond the courtyard walls. When he finally said, "A true king must first understand those who serve," a hush spread across the crowd. 2 servants stepped forward carrying a folded brown uniform made of coarse fabric. It was plain, rough, the opposite of royalty. Ayan removed his crown, his royal belt, and the heavy embroidered robe. One by one, the symbols of power left his body until he stood barefoot, dressed only in a simple tunic. He then slipped into the servant uniform, tightening the rope belt around his waist. The moment he finished, a ripple moved across the onlookers, some gasped, some smiled proudly, and a few whispered prayers. For the first time, Ayan looked like every other young man in Dumari, and strangely, he felt more himself than he ever had. But Bolo watched the ceremony from the shadows of a stone pillar, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with unspoken rage. He had spent the last decade placing his allies in important positions: cooks who owed him favors, guards who listened to his advice, servants who feared his power, and now all of it was threatened by a boy willing to embrace dirt and humility. Bolo couldn't afford to let Ayan succeed. As the crowd dispersed, and King Meda placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder, whispering, "Remember, greatness begins with humility." Bolo clenched his fist so tightly his nails cut into his palm. While everyone else celebrated the beginning of the test, he was already calculating. His mind moved fast, plotting ways to break Ayan's spirit, bend him, humiliate him until even the king would doubt his readiness. For Bolo, the servant year was not just a tradition, it was an opportunity to destroy the heir from the inside. But for Ayan, it was the first honest breath he had taken in years. As he walked toward the servant quarters, leaving behind years of privilege with every step, he did not know that someone was watching him with poisonous envy. He did not know that his courage would be tested far beyond tradition. And he did not know that by the end of this year, the destiny of the entire kingdom would depend on the strength he did not yet realize he possessed. Ayan took his first steps into the servant quarters with a strange combination of nerves and quiet excitement pulsing in his chest. The stone corridor was dim and cooler than the sunlight he had left behind, and every sound seemed louder: the scrape of wooden buckets, the shuffle of tired feet, the murmur of early morning voices. The air smelled of soap, dust, and old clay, a scent he had never paid attention to before. Several servants glanced up as he entered, their eyes widening when they recognized him, even without the royal robe. Some bowed awkwardly out of habit, some froze with shock, and others exchanged uneasy looks, unsure whether they were supposed to treat him as prince or equal. Ayan smiled gently and said nothing, not wanting to force anyone to pretend. He simply picked a corner bed, little more than a straw pad on a wooden frame, and placed his folded robe beside it. One young boy, barely 12, whispered to another, "He's really staying with us?" The second boy shrugged, his eyes filled with disbelief. But not everyone was confused. In the far corner, watching with cold interest, stood two older servants, men who had already been given orders by Minister Bolo. They exchanged a knowing smirk, already imagining the extra weight they would put on the prince's shoulders. Ayan stretched his fingers, still slightly trembling, and whispered to himself, "Let the year begin." He didn't know that this first night, simple as it seemed, would be the last peaceful one he'd have for a long time. The next morning began long before sunrise. A sharp knock rattled the wooden door, followed by a harsh voice. "New servant! Up! You start before the others!" Ayan jolted awake, confused by the unfamiliar roughness. He washed quickly, using the same cold bucket water everyone else used, and stepped outside only to find two servants waiting for him with buckets full of mud-stained rags. "The eastern corridor needs scrubbing," one of them ordered, thrusting the pile into his arms. "And you'll wash the plates from last night's banquet. They're in the back room. Don't break anything. If you slow us down, you skip breakfast." Ayan nodded, though he knew the assignment wasn't normal. No servant in the palace was given two major tasks at once, especially not someone without training. But he didn't complain. He simply rolled up his sleeves and began. Hours passed as he scrubbed the floors, his hands burning from the harsh soap. Then he moved to the piles of greasy, stacked dishes, bowls, trays, spoons, all sticky with dried gravy. He washed until his back ached, until his wrists throbbed, until he could feel the skin on his fingers peeling. Other servants passed by him, whispering. A few looked guilty, knowing the work was unfair. Others, bribed silently by Bolo, smirked and commented loudly, "He thinks being king will be easy? Let him cry now." But Ayan only kept working. Every time he felt pain, he remembered the faces of the common people outside the palace walls, the villages that relied on Dumari's leadership, and the mothers who told their children stories about good kings. He whispered quietly, "If they can do this every day, so can I." As days turned into weeks, the unfair treatment grew sharper. Bolo's influence spread like smoke, silent, suffocating. Servants who once respected Ayan now mocked him openly because they feared losing Bolo's favor. They served him cold leftovers while eating fresh food themselves. They assigned him the worst chores, sweeping out the horse stalls alone, carrying heavy jars from the kitchen to the tower, staying awake late at night to polish the banquet hall while others slept. Some intentionally spilled water in areas he had just cleaned, muttering, "Do it again, Prince." Ayan endured everything without anger, though sometimes he lay awake at night wondering why power made men cruel even before they touched the crown. Still, there were moments of unexpected warmth. An elderly cook once slipped a warm piece of bread into his hand and whispered, "Your mother would be proud of you." A young girl from the washing unit, tiny, shy, always holding her sleeves, once approached him after he helped her lift a bucket and whispered, "You're different from the others." The guards, too, began noticing him. While they weren't allowed to interfere, many of them watched him with silent respect as he carried out tasks meant to break him. One guard, a man named Joru, once said to another, "If the boy can survive this, he might become the greatest King Dumari ever had." But hidden behind these small moments of kindness was Bolo, tightening his grip. He had seen Ayan's calmness and endurance and felt his fear grow. This boy, this quiet, resilient boy, could become a king who could not be manipulated. That made him dangerous. So Bolo began planning something deeper, something more brutal, to turn the servants' irritation into hatred. The shift began subtly. One morning, the servant leader, who had always been stern but fair, suddenly demanded that Ayan clean not only the courtyard but also the entire corridor leading to the noble wing, tasks that normally required 5 men. When Ayan finished, drenched in sweat, he was told he had missed a single corner. The leader smirked and ordered him to clean the entire path again from the start. At lunchtime, instead of being given food, a servant simply shrugged and said, "No meal for you today. Orders." That night, Ayan fell asleep hungry, sore, and exhausted, but he still refused to break. Instead, he used his pain as fuel. He woke earlier than required, worked harder than anyone asked, and treated everyone, even those who mocked him, with patience. The little servant girl he had helped earlier began following him with wide eyes, as if searching for hope in his persistence. He often caught her watching him from doorways, her expression a strange mixture of fear and admiration. "Does this happen every year?" Ayan once asked her. She shook her head and whispered, "No. This year is different. Someone wants you to fail." Her words echoed in his mind long after she left. One evening, after an especially grueling day, Ayan heard voices in a dim corner of the courtyard. He paused only because he recognized one of them, the servant leader's voice, sharp and irritated. Minister Bolo said to push him harder. "He wants the boy broken before the season ends." A second voice, low and trembling, replied, "But he's stronger than we expected. He doesn't complain. He doesn't collapse. Maybe this is enough?" The leader hissed. "No. Bolo says it's not. If Ayan survives this year with even a scrap of dignity, the king will hand him the throne. And then what? Bolo loses everything. So stop questioning." Ayan's heart froze. He had always suspected unfairness, but hearing Bolo's name wrapped around cruelty like this filled him with a cold, heavy realization. This wasn't just a difficult tradition. This was sabotage. This was an attempt to crush him before he ever touched the crown. He stepped back quietly, his breath trembling as he processed the truth. Yet even then, he didn't feel anger, only clarity. If Bolo feared him this much, then Ayan understood something important. The kingdom needed a leader who wouldn't bend to men like that. As he returned to his straw bed that night, he whispered, "If this is the road I must walk, then I will walk it all the way." He had no idea that the test was about to escalate into something far more deadly, because fate was preparing a night of fire that would force him to show the strength he never knew he possessed. Ayan did not sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, the servant leader's words echoed in the darkness. "Bolo wants the boy broken." He lay on the thin straw mattress staring at the ceiling, the wood grains swirling like a map of the path he was now trapped in. He felt the weight of betrayal in his ribs, a slow tightening that made it hard to breathe, not because he feared pain or humiliation, but because Bolo's plan meant something far more dangerous than personal suffering. It meant that the kingdom itself was under quiet attack from someone the king trusted blindly. Ayan thought of his father, the stern man with a tired heart, who believed loyalty could be measured by years of service. How would he react if he learned that the man standing closest to him carried deceit in his breath? The answer frightened Ayan more than anything. So he resolved to carry the burden silently, at least for now. Before dawn, he rose from his bed, washed his face in cold water, and stepped outside into the morning fog. The palace grounds were silent except for a few guards finishing night duty. Jorah was among them and gave Ayan a brief nod, respectful, silent, acknowledging. Ayan returned it. That simple gesture, small as it was, grounded him. Even if Bolo's corruption was spreading, not everyone's heart had turned. And as he walked toward the kitchen to begin his chores, he whispered to himself, "I will not break. Not for him. Not for anyone." But fate, it seemed, had already prepared the next blow, and it would not strike quietly. Later that evening, as Ayan carried a stack of fresh linens through the west corridor, he felt the air change. At first, it was only a faint warmth, subtle enough that he dismissed it as tiredness. But by the time he reached the next corner, the warm draft turned into a wave of heat, and a thin thread of smoke curled past the edge of the wall. Ayan froze. Smoke inside the palace meant only one thing: fire. He dropped the linens and ran toward the source. The closer he got, the hotter the air became, until flames flickered around the doorway of one of the storage rooms. Servants were shouting from nearby halls, their voices frantic, some calling for water, others screaming names. The smoke grew thicker, crawling up the walls like a dark, suffocating creature. Ayan covered his mouth with his sleeve and pushed through the crowd. He saw two men trying desperately to carry out a crate of fabrics, while others fled in fear. But then he heard it, a tiny cry, almost swallowed by the roar of flames. "Help someone, please!" His heart lurched. It was the little servant girl, the same one who had whispered warnings to him. Her silhouette flickered behind the smoke inside the burning room. Without hesitation, Ayan lunged forward. A guard shouted after him, "No! It's too dangerous!" But Ayan pushed through the doorway, the heat slamming into him like the breath of a furnace. For a moment, he couldn't see anything. His eyes stung, his lungs burned, and the world blurred into swirling orange. Then he saw her, a small figure curled behind a toppled wooden rack, coughing violently. Ayan stumbled toward her, shielding his face with his arm. He grabbed her gently, lifted her into his arms, and turned back. The flames were spreading fast, licking across the ceiling, dropping burning debris. A burning beam collapsed behind him, narrowly missing his back. He tightened his grip on the girl, whispered, "Hold on to me," and used his body to shield her as he pushed through the smoke. He stumbled out of the doorway just as part of the roof gave way behind them. The guards rushed forward, grabbing the girl and supporting Ayan as he collapsed to his knees, coughing hard. His arms and hands were scorched, his skin raw and reddened, but his only thought was, "She's safe." The chaos drew King Meda from his private chambers, his cloak thrown hastily over his shoulder, his expression carved with alarm. "What happened?" he demanded. No one knew yet, only that a fire had erupted suddenly, without warning. Jorah stepped forward. "Your Majesty, the prince, he went inside the flames to save a child." The king's eyes widened as he saw Ayan kneeling on the ground, soot covering his face, his clothes singed. For a moment, Meda did not see a prince or a servant. He saw his son, breathing heavily, injured, but alive. He rushed to him, dropping to a knee. "Ayan! Why would you risk your life like that?" Ayan, still catching his breath, managed to answer softly, "Because she needed help, father." His voice cracked, but it wasn't from the smoke, it was from honesty. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't seeking praise. He had simply acted. Before the king could respond, a guard stepped forward nervously, clearly wrestling with something. He said, Your Majesty, there is something else you must hear. The courtyard grew silent. The guard gulped and continued. Before the fire spread, I overheard Minister Bolo speaking with the servant leader. He said the fire wouldn't matter. That tomorrow morning, poison would be put in your herbal drink. The silence that followed was cold and heavy. King Meda's face stiffened, not with fear, but with a heartbreak so deep it tightened his features. Poison? He whispered, disbelief shattering through him. The guard nodded, trembling. Yes, sire. He planned it for dawn. Meda slowly stood up, his chest rising with a slow, controlled breath. His eyes, normally stern, looked wounded in a way Ayan had never seen. The betrayal was personal. Deep. Violent. A betrayal not of crown, but of trust. Guards stormed the minister's quarters immediately. Bolo tried to talk his way out of it at first, claiming misunderstandings, lies, fabricated stories by jealous servants. But when the guard who overheard him described every word in detail, including phrases only Bolo used, the truth cracked open like a rotten shell. Bolo's calmness evaporated. He tried to run. He shoved 2 guards aside and bolted down the stairway, but more soldiers blocked his path. They dragged him, kicking and shouting, to the king's throne room, where the flames outside cast trembling light through the windows. King Meda stood tall, but the anguish on his face was unmistakable. Why? He asked quietly. Not as a king. As a man betrayed. Bolo spat angrily. Because you've grown weak, Meda. A boy like him cannot rule Dumari. My son was meant for greatness. His voice cracked with desperation rather than conviction. Ayan watched from behind the guards, his body aching but his spirit clear. The king's voice echoed through the hall, colder than the night air. I trusted you more than I trusted my own blood, yet you would kill me and destroy the kingdom just to satisfy your hunger for power. Bolo sneered. The kingdom needs strength. The king stepped forward slowly, his voice trembling. Strength without honor is corruption. And corruption deserves no crown. He raised his hand, and without further words, the guards took beyond the lookout away. The hall remained silent for several long seconds. No cheers, no whispers, just the heavy breath of shock settling in the air. For the first time in his life, Ayan truly understood the burden of leadership, not the glory, not the applause, but the pain of seeing betrayal from those closest to you. Later that night, long after the fire had been extinguished and the palace regained some of its order, King Meda visited the servant quarters. Ayan was sitting quietly on the edge of his straw bed, bandages wrapped around his reddened hands. He didn't expect the king to appear. No one did. The room fell into stunned silence as Meda entered. He approached his son slowly, almost uncertainly, as if unsure how to speak after the revelations of that night. Then, in a voice softer than Ayan had ever heard, he said, You risked your life, and still you think of others first. A true king acts not for glory, but for the helpless. Ayan looked down, humbled. I only did what anyone would have done. Meda shook his head. No. Not anyone. The king knelt beside him, something Ayan never imagined he would witness, and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. Tomorrow, Ayan, the kingdom must know the truth. And the kingdom must know its rightful heir. Ayan's breath caught. He opened his mouth to speak, but the king interrupted gently. Sleep now. Your journey is far from over. As Meda stood to leave, the little servant girl peeked from behind a curtain, her eyes wide with quiet gratitude. Ayan gave her a small smile. For the first time since the servant year began, he felt something settle inside him, a growing sense that his trials had a purpose, a direction, a destiny that could no longer be denied. And as the night deepened, Ayan realized that the dawn would not just bring answers. It would bring the beginning of everything he was meant to become. Ayan barely had time to steady his breath before the king's voice, shaken yet commanding, ordered the guards to search the palace for Chief Minister Bolo. The courtyard, moments ago buzzing with panic and smoke, fell into a stunned silence as whispers rippled across the gathered crowd. People who had only ever seen the minister smile with gentle restraint now exchanged glances, realizing that behind that soft exterior had been a predator waiting for the perfect distraction. Ayan stood still, his clothes still carrying the heat of the fire, watching as torches lit the hallways and guards sprinted in disciplined rows. King Meda's eyes found his son, anger, betrayal, and a deep tiredness swirling within them, but beneath all of it was something else: gratitude. Before Ayan could speak, a guard emerged from the shadows dragging beyond lookout forward, his wrists bound, his face pale, his composure shattered. The same guard who had overheard everything during the chaos stepped up, recounting every poisonous word Bolo had spoken, how he had planned to use the fire as cover, how he meant to slip venom into the king's herbal drink at dawn, how he believed the crown belonged to his untested son rather than a prince forged through humility. King Meda listened without blinking, the betrayal cutting so deep that for a moment, even the flames behind them seemed to dim. The king spoke only once. "Bolo, I gave you my trust. You wanted my throne." The minister tried to protest, but his voice trembled, his lies collapsing under the weight of truth. The guards dragged him away, and as he disappeared into the dim hallway, something inside the palace shifted, as if a poison that had been quietly flowing for years was finally being drawn out. Ayan stood there, watching the man who had orchestrated his humiliation being taken away, and yet, he felt no triumph. Only a strange heaviness, a reminder that power always reveals the true nature of people. And tonight, it had revealed two things: the corruption of a minister, and the strength of a young man who had not broken. When the night finally calmed, and the last of the smoke surrendered to the early whispers of dawn, Ayan found himself walking the palace corridors that had once felt like a maze of judgment. Everything looked the same: red clay walls, wooden beams, lanterns flickering softly, but nothing felt the same anymore. Servants who used to avoid his eyes now paused, their faces gentler, humbled, and oddly apologetic. Ayan didn't blame them. He had seen enough to understand that many had been pressured, bribed, or frightened into mistreating him. But something in their expression told him they now saw him differently, not as a disguised boy forced into labor, but as someone who had earned a kind of respect that wasn't tied to royalty. As he walked toward the open-air courtyard, he heard quick footsteps behind him. It was the small servant girl he had carried out of the burning room. She stood there, trembling slightly, holding a broken wooden bracelet in her hand, something that must have been cherished before the fire melted half of it. When she spoke, her voice was small but steady. "You came back for me," she whispered. "Nobody ever comes back." Ayan lowered himself to her height, his voice soft, almost fragile after the chaos of the night. "Everyone deserves to be saved," he said. "Even if they think they don't matter." Her eyes glistened, and she leaned forward to hug him, something no servant would dare do under normal circumstances. But in that moment, titles didn't exist, and neither did hierarchy. There was only human instinct, gratitude, and the echo of fear slowly fading. King Meda watched this from the far end of the courtyard, unnoticed. He saw, perhaps for the first time, a version of his son he had never fully understood, a leader who didn't need a crown to earn loyalty. A leader who didn't need to command respect to receive it. He saw a boy who had finally learned the lesson he had hoped the ancient tradition would teach, and a man who had discovered his own purpose through suffering. As the first sunlight crept over the kingdom of Dumari, washing the burnt edges of the palace in pale gold, King Meda felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, pure and heavy, like the beginning of a long-forgotten song. When morning fully broke, the sound of drums rolled across the kingdom, awakening villagers, traders, elders, and children who had slept unaware of the night's conspiracies. A vast crowd gathered in the royal courtyard, murmuring with curiosity as the king appeared atop the stone steps, his posture regal yet softened by the exhaustion etched into his face. Ayan stood beside him in the same simple servant garments, his hands still carrying the faint scent of smoke, his expression humble and unsure. He didn't know why the king had called the kingdom together so quickly, but he sensed something irreversible was about to happen. The audience fell silent as King Meda raised his hand. His voice, deep and steady, echoed across the courtyard. "A leader is not born through comfort," he began, but through the weight he is willing to carry. The crowd leaned closer. Last night, while flames rose in my home, one young man chose not to save himself but to save another. He asked for no recognition, no praise, no reward. Ayan felt dozens of eyes turn toward him, and his heartbeat quickened, but he didn't move. This young man did not act like a servant, the king continued, nor like a prince. He acted like a true leader. The murmurs rose, spreading through the courtyard like wind rippling through tall grass. Before Ayan could process the king's next words, he felt his father place a gentle hand on his shoulder. I present to you, the king said, his voice swelling with emotion that cracked slightly at the end, the future king of Dumari, Prince Ayan. The courtyard erupted, not in staged applause, not in hollow cheers, but in a roar of genuine affection. Some clapped, some cried, some simply smiled with relief, because they had witnessed not just a succession, but a transformation. Ayan's throat tightened as he heard the cheers. He hadn't sought the crown, hadn't even thought he would truly earn it. But standing there, with the weight of expectation and love pouring toward him from all directions, he understood something with startling clarity. Leadership wasn't about perfection, it was about responsibility, sacrifice, and the courage to face darkness without losing compassion. As the drums thundered and the cheers shook the courtyard walls, King Meda leaned toward his son and whispered, "You are ready now." And for the first time since his servant trial began, Ayan believed it. The cheers were still echoing across the courtyard when Ayan felt the world tilt slightly, not from dizziness, but from the sudden understanding that everything ahead of him would be heavier, sharper, more demanding than anything behind him. People reached out to touch his arm as he descended the steps, elders with trembling hands, warriors with pride shining in their eyes, children who looked at him as though he had stepped out of a story told around village fires. But woven among the celebration was an unspoken truth: the kingdom was wounded. The fire had damaged several quarters of the palace, and the betrayal of a long-trusted minister had shaken the people's sense of safety. Ayan sensed this fracture as clearly as he sensed the warmth of their applause. This wasn't the moment to celebrate his crown, it was the moment to step into responsibility. Even as he walked through the courtyard, the image of the little girl he had saved kept returning to him. Her trembling hug, her half-melted bracelet, her quiet voice saying that no one had ever come back for her. A kingdom where a child felt that forgotten, something needed to change. And so, while celebrations erupted in the villages that afternoon, with drums and dancers spreading the news across Dumari, Ayan slipped away from the palace gates with only 2 guards shadowing him at a respectful distance. He wandered into the servants' quarters, the markets near the palace walls, the narrow alleys where workers slept after long days of labor. He listened. Really listened. To the woman who washed royal linens until her hands cracked. To the cook who fed hundreds yet sometimes slept hungry. To the stable boy who had dreams of becoming a warrior but no patron to support him. Every story tugged at something inside Ayan, something firm and unyielding. Leadership, he realized, wasn't about the crown placed on his head earlier. It was about the weight he now carried in his chest. When he finally returned to the palace, dusty and tired, King Meda was waiting for him at the entrance, studying him with knowing eyes. "You went to see them?" the king murmured. Ayan nodded. The king let out a breath that sounded almost relieved. "Good. Then you are already doing what I never dared to do." And in that moment, father and son understood each other in a way they never had before, one stepping down from the throne of burden, and the other stepping up without hesitation. The next few days moved like a storm and a sunrise happening at the same time, chaos and clarity intertwined. News of Minister Bolo's betrayal spread quickly across Dumari, but instead of dividing the kingdom, it united people under a single shared belief: that the palace needed change, and Prince Ayan might finally be the one to deliver it. Ayan didn't waste time. He stepped into the charred remains of the servant dormitory, sleeves rolled up, ash smudging his face, working side by side with carpenters and laborers. He insisted on rebuilding not only the burned areas but the entire servant living quarters, transforming them into spacious, dignified homes. The workers tried to stop him, some embarrassed, others overwhelmed, but Ayan refused to stand idle. He carried bricks, lifted beams, fetched water, and laughed in a way that reminded everyone he had once lived exactly as they did. King Meda watched his son throw himself into the work and felt pride settle in his chest like a warm stone. But it wasn't only the physical rebuilding that mattered. Ayan reorganized the entire servant system, introducing fair wages, rest periods, and a council where workers could voice their concerns directly to him. The elder servants cried the first day they sat in the council chamber, because no king or prince had ever asked what they felt. And through it all, Ayan kept checking on the little girl he had saved. Her name was Sia. She limped at first from smoke inhalation, but she followed him everywhere, her once fearful eyes now glowing with trust. She became a symbol, small, fragile, but representing everything Ayan wanted to protect. But not everyone was pleased. In the shadows of the prison hall, Bolo watched from behind iron bars as messengers rushed in and out delivering updates about the prince. His jealousy twisted into something darker. He will fail, Bolo whispered to himself. He must. But even he could sense that the kingdom's heart had shifted. Ayan's popularity was rising faster than rumors could poison it, and the people, once indifferent, were now fiercely loyal. This, Bolo realized, was the real threat, not the crown, but a leader loved by the people. Meanwhile, King Meda began preparing the ceremonial transition of power. His beard seemed grayer, his posture slightly heavier, but his eyes shone bright whenever he watched Ayan lead. One late evening, the king entered Ayan's room and found him studying parchment after parchment filled with ideas: education for servant children, a healing house for laborers, new safety rules for palace fires. "You are building a kingdom before you even sit on the throne," the king said softly. Ayan looked up, surprised. "Shouldn't I?" King Meda smiled in a way that carried both pride and regret. "Yes. But I wish I had started as early as you." He placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You're not simply ready, Ayan. You're necessary." And those words stayed with Ayan long into the night as the torches flickered and the weight of the future pressed gently, not painfully, against him. The coronation day arrived with skies so clear it felt like the heavens themselves had paused to watch. Thousands gathered: farmers, merchants, warriors, mothers with children on their hips, elders leaning on carved sticks. The palace drums began their slow, powerful rhythm, each beat rolling through Dumari like the heartbeat of something ancient awakening. Ayan wore simple ceremonial robes, nothing extravagant, nothing gilded. He insisted on it. A leader shouldn't blind people with gold, he had told the royal tailor. Let them see me, not the decorations. When he stepped onto the raised stone platform, the crowd erupted, shouts, tears, raised hands, chants of his name. But Ayan didn't lift his chin with pride. He scanned the crowd gently until he found Sia sitting on an elder servant's lap near the front. She smiled, missing teeth, bruised cheek, hopeful eyes. And that small smile steadied him. King Meda stood beside his son, carrying the crown that had burdened him for years. The crown was heavy, not just in weight but in history, sacrifice, and mistakes. When he held it above Ayan's head, his hands shook, just slightly. "Dumari," the king announced, his voice carrying strength and exhaustion all at once. "Today, I pass the throne to a leader who has walked where you walk, eaten what you eat, and suffered what you suffer. A leader who has not learned from books or privilege, but from humility and fire." Ayan bowed his head. The king lowered the crown, but instead of placing it on Ayan's head, he paused and took a breath. "Ayan," he whispered so only his son could hear. "Forgive me for not seeing your strength sooner." Ayan looked up, eyes warm. "Father, you taught me by letting me live." And with that, King Meda placed the crown gently on his son's head. The crowd roared, waves of sound rising into the sky. Ayan straightened, not arrogantly but with quiet determination, and addressed the kingdom for the first time as their ruler. "I will not promise perfection," he said, voice steady and human. "But I promise presence. I promise to serve you the way you have served this kingdom. I promise to be a king who listens before he commands." And as he spoke those simple words, something extraordinary happened. Not fireworks, not magic, not spectacle, just a collective exhale from thousands of people who, for the first time in generations, felt truly seen. Sia clapped with all her might. The workers wiped tears. Even the guards stood taller. And in that immense yet intimate moment, Dumari didn't just gain a king, it gained a new heartbeat, steady, humble, and unbreakably human.